All right, we are going to start. So, welcome again to the sixth episode in our series, Gender Violence and the State in Asia. I'm just going to take you through a few technical issues and I'll give you a little introduction of WILPF and why we're doing this series. Then I will hand you over to Barbara Chojanowska. She will introduce our speaker of today and the academic network. My name is Emma Bergesser. I'm the International Women's Power to Stop War Coordinator at WILPF. So to start with some technical issues, first of all, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the webinar format, you are all muted and we cannot see your webcams. That's okay. That is the way it's supposed to work. If we had all of you unmuted, then it would be chaos. There will be a chance at the end of the webinar to have a discussion, and I'll take you through how to raise your hand so that we can unmute you then. I will turn on my webcam right now, just so that you can see who's talking to you. There we go. Hi, everyone. This is me. If anything goes wrong, if your connection fails, if for some reason you can't hear us, we recommend you to force quit the program and try to log in again using the same link that you've used right now. But we hope that won't happen, of course. And finally, we are recording today. We record all of our webinars so people can watch them back on YouTube. Please keep that in mind if you do want to ask a question, that your voice will be recorded. All right, so those are the technical issues. Then a little bit about WILPF and why we're doing this series. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is the longest serving women's peace organization in the world. We work on trying to integrate issues of women's human rights and peace and security every day around the world with our 30 sections and in our international offices in New York and Geneva. We have started this campaign, Women's Power to Stop War, because next year WILPF is turning 100 years old. And we are celebrating that in a really, really big way. We are organizing a conference in April next year. You are all invited. And this webinar series is a way to gain momentum moving towards April 2015 and to tell you all about it. And to get you excited for what will be discussed at the conference. So I hope you will all be there. The conference planning is going really well. We've just had a bunch of submissions from other NGOs who want to participate and organize sessions, and we're sorting through them now. So things are really getting very exciting for the conference. So with that note, I will hand you over to Barbara Chojanowska, who will tell you a bit about the academic network. Barbara, you're unmuted now, and here is my webcam request. Go ahead, Barbara.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the WILPF Academic Network. For those of you who join us for the first time today, I would like to start with a few words about the network. So the WILPF Academic Network is a global think tank that mainly addresses the issues of gender, peace, and security. And our main aim is to connect a global network of activists, peace activists, and academics. And in our network, we have some university professors, independent researchers, and also doctoral students. And if you would like to get to know more about the academic network, please visit our website. It should be now displayed on the screen. You can find there the information about each and every scholar in the network, not only about the whole network. And if you still have any questions, please feel free to drop us an email at academic@wilpf.ch. And now I would like to share with you some very exciting news. WILPF has just announced the Women's Power to Stop War essay competition. And you are all invited to write an essay on the topic, how would you change the current narrative of peacemaking to be more holistic? You have quite a good time to submit an essay because the deadline is in the end of December. And if you've ever wanted Cynthia and Law to read any of your essays or work, now you have a great chance because she is one of our judges in the judging committee, together with Laurie Cohen and Clary Duncanson. And there are also some cool prizes. There is one cash prize, but also free tickets to the WILPF 2015 conference. And especially if you win, your essay will be made available to all participants. So please also visit our website for more details. And one of the major activities of this academic network is our webinar series. We previously hosted 5 webinars. One of Women, Peace and Security agenda, then on disarmament in Africa, on translating international law to grassroots activism, sexual violence in conflict, and the last one on the political economy of violence against women. And they were all recorded, so if you couldn't join us at that particular time, you can watch them whenever you want. But today, our special speaker is Amy Barrow. Amy is assistant professor in the Faculty of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and she's also a founding member of the Center for Rights and Justice. Her academic expertise includes the UN Security Council Resolution 425 and development of norms of women, peace and security, gender and the law, human rights, and the advancement of women's rights. And she has been an active member of WILPF for several years, and currently, apart from being a member of our academic network, she is also a member of 1325 working group. So Amy, the floor is yours.
Just 1 second while I unmute you, Amy. Thank you, Barbara. All right. Amy, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm really delighted to be here. I wanted to check firstly with Emma whether you can see my webcam or if that's not feasible. I'm not sure.
1 second. Let me try to send you. No, I don't think we can see it today, but I think your voice will have to do.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Never mind. I'd like to thank my colleague Mark Mack, who really spent a long time trying to help me set up the webcam. But it's my pleasure to be here, and thank you to Emma and also to Barbara and WILPF for the kind introduction. And then also it's very interesting to hear more about the WILPF network, and to be part of the WILPF Academic Network is fantastic. I'd like to talk to you today really about gender violence and the state in Asia. I can't see my PowerPoint presentation at all. So Emma is...
Yes, it's there. Don't worry. Possible? I will make sure to follow along with your talk.
Okay, so I'm concentrating on gender violence and the state in Asia, and there's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, with being based in Asia and being based in Hong Kong, I've been here a number of years now, so I wanted to explain about some of the concepts about how cultural norms, laws and policies can actually exacerbate gender-based violence. And my talk is obviously focusing on Hong Kong, and also I'll look at experiences in Nepal and also in the Philippines. We're starting off on this first slide. I wanted to explain a little bit about how I would define about gender and violence. And I think it's important to say at the outset that while gender is obviously inclusive of both men and women's roles, that very often laws, policies, and cultural practices have a disproportionate impact on women's lives, because law can often be gendered. When I say this, I'm coming from the starting point that traditionally many laws and policies have largely been focused on the public sphere. And in terms of women's lives, for a vast majority of women, their lives are often located within the private sphere. So laws and policies might focus on employment, formal employment, but for women, if their lives center around marriage and within the family, then traditionally there has been a public-private divide with the law. It is changing to some degree with growing awareness that laws and policies, potentially are gendered, but I would say that still the law is quite archaic at times in the way that it deals with gender-based violence. Also, I would say that even within international law, international human rights law, when you look to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, Article 3 states that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. But sometimes in reality, even though laws appear to be gender neutral, they appear to apply to everyone, sometimes they fail to recognize the differences between men and women's lives, and that can have detrimental consequences for women. In terms of violence, I would like to say that I think it's best to look at violence not only in terms of physical violence, whether it be sexual violence or domestic violence, that we also have to think more broadly about structural violence, and that the very silences of law is a phrase that Hilary Charlesworth describes it as. The silences of law can actually have negative consequences for women's status and equality within society. So we have to think more broadly about also structural violence and the impact of the law. If we go to the next slide, talking about Asia, I've been here for a number of years, and of course in terms of the geopolitical landscape of Asia, it's an incredibly diverse region. And I'm aware that some listeners out there will be in parts of Asia, such as Nepal, India, other places, and I'd really welcome their thoughts later on after some of the things that I discuss about. But the geopolitical landscape of Asia is incredibly diverse. You have developed and underdeveloped states. You will have seen from the news the incredible tensions that have taken place in the region within the past 2 years, even as an example, looking at the military coup in Thailand. We have a number of states emerging from protracted conflict: East Timor, Sri Lanka, Nepal. And at the same time, you have states which would be considered more developed. So for instance, Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, where I'm based, and then Taiwan. And I think you have to put this into the context of the scale of Asia as well. When you look at Asia, even within China, for example, if I were to fly from Hong Kong to Beijing, it would be a 3-hour journey. So if you compare that to Europe, you can see that it's phenomenally a very vast distance between different areas of Asia, and that's bound to have some impact on the geopolitics. In terms of the diversity of the population, again, I wanted to flag up the fact that there are many different ethnic groups within Asia. There's many different religious groups. I failed to put Islam on here, which is an oversight on my part, but you have to think also about the role of, even within states, for instance, in India, you have the operation of both secular and personal law, Sharia law. So even within individual states, there's incredible diversity. If we go to the next slide. In terms of Asia, you can actually see that although I'm speaking broadly about Asia, because of this incredible diversity, it's by no means what I say today applies to every single state within Asia. And Asia can be broken down into various subregions, including Southeast Asia, East Asia, and South Asia. I haven't included Australia and some of the Pacific islands within this very broad definition. And my examples today are going to draw on Hong Kong, given recent events, and then also looking at Nepal and the Philippines as two states that are in a fragile position, having emerged from conflict in the case of Nepal, and continuing to be in a protracted insurgency within the Philippines. So if we go to the next slide, in terms of cultural norms, laws, and policies, while I'm focusing on Asia and thinking about how this plays out within the Asian context, part of the reason I'm doing this is because I feel that Asia is really understudied as a region, but it's incredibly important. And increasingly with the rise of China as a major international player, I think it's important that we start to focus our attention to think about what is the role of Asia within contemporary global politics. And I would say what I'm going to discuss is not unique to Asia. It's important to remember that. Professor Yakin Ertug, who is the former Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, did discuss about experiences even within Europe. When you think about cultural practices, they can have a detrimental impact on women's lives. But very often when we think about cultural practices, we tend to look to the other. We tend to think beyond the boundaries of our own existence in some ways. So even the fact that school hours in Europe are often from 9 to 3 p.m., or the fact that shops usually only open between 9 and 5:30 p.m., for instance, is an example that it's restrictive in some ways to women's lives, and it could have a detrimental impact. Women may not be able to work. Women might be expected to work part-time. There's always the assumption that someone will be there to take care of the child after school finishes at 3 p.m. and who is in a position to take care of the child. So even in her experiences looking at the UK, Netherlands, and Sweden, she said that you can actually see that even within these societies that are perceived as being developed, having very good gender equality, in actual fact, some of the cultural practices might be detrimental to women. So it's not unique to Asia. I don't mean to exoticize Asia in any way, and I think that's important to say at the outset. If we go to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more about the legal framework. Currently, there is no international treaty on the prevention of violence against women. CEDAW potentially touches on violence against women. It largely focuses on the issue of non-discrimination. Within Asia and globally, CEDAW has actually been widely signed and ratified. But I'd give a note of caution that while it has been widely signed and ratified, in actual fact, there are many reservations made against CEDAW, and even to core articles of CEDAW, including Article 2 on non-discrimination. And given that there are this amount of reservations, in some ways this potentially undermines the treaty. Within Asia, for example, all ASEAN members, that's Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they have acceded to CEDAW and to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In terms of the legal framework, there are no supranational bodies that cover the entirety of Asia. And I think because you do have these sub-regions of Asia, that's quite understandable. But there are a lack of regional human rights mechanisms. Exceptionally, there is ASEAN's Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights that was adopted in 2009, but it's quite a young commission, and it's probably quite difficult to evaluate the work that it's done to date. And what are the implications of having this intergovernmental commission in practice. If we go to the next slide, to give some historical perspective, when you look at Asia, there are a number of things happening in terms of how universal human rights are perceived within the region. And I want to take you back to think about the Asian values debate. I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with this, especially if you're studying about international human rights and the foundation of rights. But within Asia, there was a bit of a kickback against universal human rights because they were perceived as being an ideological imposition of Western values. And for states such as Singapore and China, they suggested that in many ways there were already value frameworks within society. So for instance, cultural values, Confucianism within China, and which is also influential in Singapore, but that these provided some sort of cultural regime of values, and therefore why was it necessary to then adopt a human rights regime of values? So there was a bit of a kickback against universal human rights, and also largely focused on the idea that these states were developing at the time, and therefore it was much more important to try to eradicate poverty, and the trade-off there is for civil liberties. So for some political rights, it was maybe put to one side, and development was the priority. So I think that has a lasting legacy in some ways for skepticism and resistance to international human rights norms, even though many states have acceded to international human rights treaties. Okay, if we go to the next slide. If I take you here, I'm in Hong Kong, and when I originally discussed with Barbara about doing this talk, I didn't anticipate that I would be talking about Hong Kong, but given the events and given the intense focus of the global media on Hong Kong in the past couple of weeks, I feel like it's important to touch on issues within Hong Kong, and some of the implications from Hong Kong's relationship with China. When we look at these pictures, the top one that we see is actually within a very central district of Hong Kong, in Admiralty and Central on Hong Kong Island. The picture down on the left-hand side is actually of my university, and that's the University Mall at Chinese University of Hong Kong. And we see here thousands of students sitting there in a rally, essentially kicking off a week-long boycott, which is lingering on, actually, I would say, at the moment. And on the right-hand side, what I wanted to show was this photo, which is of National Day celebrations in Hong Kong. And we can see a lone protester who is Paul Zimmerman, who's a councillor from Pok Fu Lam district in Hong Kong Island. And he's holding up a yellow umbrella. Yellow has become a symbol of the movement of Occupy Central, and also umbrellas. If any of you saw the images for the, you will have seen the Hong Kong police using quite excessive force in terms of the response to the people who were demonstrating. So you see them pepper spraying demonstrators, and the demonstrators were using umbrellas to try to resist the pepper spray, and so it's been termed as Umbrella Revolution. And these are just 3 images to show you, and then I'm going to try to explain a bit more about what are the root causes of this social movement, but also try to bring in a gender analysis. Not specifically on Occupy Central itself, but more broadly in connection with Hong Kong's special administrative status. So if we go to the next slide. In Hong Kong, we are under the system of one country, two systems. It is an executive-led style of governance. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, the Executive Council is appointed by the Chief Executive. They are not democratically elected. Also, we have a situation where the legislature is not democratically elected within Hong Kong. So there's this perception that there is a democratic deficit. At the same time, Hong Kong's identity is struggling, I would say, at the moment, because on the one hand, Hong Kong has been returned to the People's Republic of China, it's part of China, but at the same time it still is a post-colonial society. Because of this one country, two systems, it means that the system that was in place under the British colonial government, as far as it is a common law legal tradition, for example, is supposed to remain in place for at least 50 years until 2047. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to show you a map which you can see here Hong Kong, and actually Hong Kong Island right down in the south is actually quite a small part of the territory. You can see that above Hong Kong Island there is Kowloon. So the majority of the demonstrations have been taking place in the north of Hong Kong Island and also into Kowloon in areas like Mong Kok. And further up you can see the new territories, and the new territories are directly attached to the Chinese mainland. You can see a city there, Shenzhen in Guangdong province, which is actually a special economic zone within China. So that's just to give you a sense of the geographical landscape of Hong Kong. And if we go to the next slide, I want to explain a little bit about some of the cultural, political, and social dynamics within Hong Kong. It is a society which is largely based on Confucius values. Confucianism is an ethical and philosophical system. And there are a number of things I want to pick out. For instance, a strong sense of filial piety, which is respect for elders and ancestors. And then also the issue about relationships and the status of men within the family is somewhat elevated. At the same time, while you do have these traditional Chinese cultural values, Hong Kong is a very international and cosmopolitan city. But in terms of its homogeneity, a large majority of the population are of Han Chinese culture. But at the same time, you do also have very significant groups within society. So for instance, migrant workers, there are approximately 300,000 workers who come from largely Indonesia and also the Philippines. There are also sex workers from China, Southeast Asia, and then refugees and asylum seekers who quite interestingly are coming to Hong Kong from West Africa as well as Pakistan. So the cycle of migration is perhaps not what you would expect, but these are very significant groups within society as well. More recently, in terms of a contemporary context, there are a high number of single women, which is similar to Shanghai and Tokyo. If we go to the next slide. So I wanted to explain a little bit more about what are the root causes. And because of this one country, two systems, one of the quasi-constitutional documents within Hong Kong is the Basic Law. The Basic Law sets out a number of articles. Article 5 is the one that I showed you earlier, which basically says that Hong Kong should remain as it is until 2047. So the Chinese system of governance and judicial system should not apply. So basically the socialist system should not apply for at least 50 years. Again, under Article 2, there's express provision that Hong Kong should have a high degree of autonomy. But I think increasingly there is concern that even though these articles suggest that Hong Kong should remain as it is for 50 years, that there's a steady erosion, potentially, of civil liberties within Hong Kong. So there are concerns over increased censorship, academic freedom, which, compared with other states in Asia, I would say that Hong Kong has quite a strong sense of academic freedom, but there is concern that over time, these aspects of life in Hong Kong, freedom of expression, is going to steadily erode. If we go to the next slide. There are some notable exceptions because Hong Kong is a special administrative region. For instance, in foreign affairs, defense, and national security, they are not the priority of Hong Kong. They have to be taken on board by the central government in Beijing. So really, as far as public order is concerned, that is something that's an internal affair within Hong Kong. I also wanted to pick out Article 40 of the Basic Law, because for many of you, you might not be familiar with the fact that there are indigenous inhabitants within Hong Kong, and you wouldn't necessarily believe that to be the case, but for those very small groups, inhabitants that were here before the British colonized Hong Kong, they are perceived as being the indigenous inhabitants. So you have very established families within Hong Kong, the Tang clan, for instance. And I want to raise that at this particular point, and I'll explain a bit further on how this has implications for gender-based violence towards indigenous women in Hong Kong from those groups. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So I'm sure for many of you, if you've been following the situation in Hong Kong, you will have seen that the Occupy Central movement is very much challenging the imposition of what is perceived to be screening of candidates for the chief executive position within Hong Kong. There is an article within the Basic Law which suggests that there should be universal suffrage, but it doesn't really specify clearly the means for achieving universal suffrage. And the Chinese government, the central government, has said that 2 to 3 candidates must first be approved by a nominating committee. So for academics such as Benny Tai, who has been leading the Occupy Central campaign, he would argue that universal suffrage has to be in line with international standards. And if we go to the next slide, I want to raise whether universal suffrage is actually guaranteed, because in the Basic Law it's quite unclear. But at the same time, if we look to, for instance, Article 26, suggests that permanent residents should have the right to vote and the right to stand for election. And also, Hong Kong does have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It does remain in force within Hong Kong law. So if you then think about what the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says, it clearly states that to vote and to be elected at genuine periodic elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage. And it doesn't say anything about being vetted. It doesn't say anything about being approval by nominating committees. So I think if you read the Basic Law alongside the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, there's a strong case to be made that Hong Kong should abide by international standards on universal suffrage. I want to explain a little bit more about how this political system impacts potentially on women. So if we go to the next slide, with the Legislative Council, for example, there are currently 70 members of the Legislative Council. There are 35 members, so half are directly elected. But then for half, we have what is termed as functional constituencies. These represent special interest groups, and I've highlighted a few of the different groups. Now, potentially this is problematic because you have huge sectors of the population who may be unrepresented. For instance, if we go to the next slide, in terms of, for example, these functional constituencies, it's not as though they could represent women who stay at home, women who don't work, women who are in casual work. So you really have a biased representation to certain professional groups within the community. And then obviously if they're within a professional group, there could be very specific agenda for what they want to achieve in the legislative council. So there is this perception that there is a huge democratic deficit. Additionally, because of what is taking place at the moment and for a long time, legislative reform has been particularly slow. So for instance, some of the laws here which are relate to sexual offences, for example, are quite old. In fact, they're a hangover from the British colonial government. So you're looking at laws on sexual offences that have since been abolished within the UK. The current law, which looks at rape, for example, in Hong Kong, is probably from the 70s, the 70s model from the UK. So you really have these outdated laws. And I think with the current political situation, it does hamper the Legislative Council's ability to actually move forward on legislative reform on these areas. At the same time, in Hong Kong, partially because of what's happening, but also because of, I guess, deep conservatism within society, there are some notable absences within the legal framework. So, as I referred to earlier about Hilary Charlesworth, the silences of law, an absence of legislation on sexual orientation and gender identity. And for me, that seems so, I don't know, behind the times in many ways. When you think about the fact that many countries now are moving towards same-sex marriage and supporting that, even within places such as Argentina, it feels that Hong Kong is kind of in this uncomfortable position in terms of being a post-colonial society at the same time as being part of China, and this could be detrimental. Okay, if we go to the next slide. For the role of institutional mechanisms for the advancement of women, there are some key institutions here within Hong Kong. We do have an Equal Opportunities Commission, which is responsible for the investigation and conciliation of complaints. I would say that this is the main avenue of redress. There's potentially less court cases that are brought under the Sex Discrimination Ordinance. We also have the Women's Commission, and the Women's Commission is an advisory body which has created, for example, a gender mainstreaming checklist to be put into action by Hong Kong's Policy Bureau. And some of the implications for CEDAW's promotion, however, are because it is an advisory body, it's not a central part of government. So it can only offer advice, it lacks power, and in some ways that might potentially undermine the promotion of CEDAW within Hong Kong. Some other implications which come from the one country, two systems are the fact that if we go to the next slide, you will see that for the status of women, because of this relationship, there is an increase in cross-border marriages between Hong Kong men and mainland Chinese women. But this, again, exposes those women to the risk of domestic violence. There can be a language barrier with Chinese and speaking Putonghua or Mandarin, and also for Hong Kong men who would largely speak Cantonese. And there are very clear cultural distinctions between China and Hong Kong, even though both are Chinese societies. At the same time, there's also an increase in migration of mainland Chinese to Hong Kong. This can lead to an increase of groups at risk, sex workers. And I also wanted to highlight about mainland Chinese women giving birth in Hong Kong, because this has implications for other groups of women within society, and potentially places those other categories of women at risk, partially because of the policies by the Hong Kong government. And this is an example of how gender-based violence or structural violence could be exacerbated by law or policy. In 2012, the Hong Kong government were quite concerned. They wanted to try to reduce the number of mainland Chinese women coming to give birth in Hong Kong. So as a way to try and prevent that, they created very high fees for those women to use public emergency services at public hospitals. But they didn't really think about the knock-on impact that might have on other groups of women. So those very high fees remain in place. And when I come on to discuss about domestic workers in Hong Kong, you'll see how this could potentially put other women at risk. If we go to the next slide. I wanted to go back to think about sexuality and reproduction, and how, picking up on the fact that there is no anti-discrimination legislation on sexual orientation, for example, to think about the heteronormativity of laws. And this is very much the case in Hong Kong. We govern laws on sexuality and reproduction. Women's lives are in some ways controlled by the law and its focus. But for those people who do not fit neatly within the category of woman and man, it's quite problematic. So we had a very important case in the past couple of years, which was a WN Registrar of Marriages, which concerned a post-operative transgender woman who wanted to marry her male partner. And she was prevented from doing so at the first stage of the court of first instance, largely because of the concern that this would open up the possibility of same-sex marriage, because they failed to recognize that this post-operative transgender woman was a real woman for the purposes of marriage. And when we look at marriage within Hong Kong, the definition is one man and one woman. But I think it's important to put this also in the context of potentially the damage that can be done by colonial governments. Previously in Hong Kong, prior to the 70s, there were polygamous marriages in Hong Kong. They were sanctioned by law. And when the colonial government came in, it was the colonial government that imposed this hide and hide definition of marriage, that it should be one man and one woman. Of course, this move now has implications when we think about transgender persons within Hong Kong and their ability to get married. And at the moment, there is some law reform going through, which will actually allow for post-operative transgender women and men to marry their partners. So that is very good, but at the same time, it's requiring transgender persons to go through full surgery, forced sterilization, effectively. So there are negative consequences from some of this law reform. If we go on to the next slide. Within Hong Kong, there are a number of laws also, for instance, maternity leave and childcare. And I wanted to pick up on this issue because in some ways when we look at maternity leave regimes within Asia, compared to Europe and other places, the amount of leave is well, 10 weeks is a very short period of time for paid maternity leave. And I think obviously within the US as well in the States, they also have a very short like maternity leave, and I don't think it's even necessarily statutory paid maternity leave. It's open to negotiation with employers. So Asia is not necessarily unique. Hong Kong's not necessarily unique in this sense. But what are the implications of this? The government here do not really provide subsidized childcare. It's very limited. They don't really provide much subsidized elder care. So the facilities to send your child to daycare are extremely rare if you can actually get a space for your child. So it means that there is an outsourcing of care, an outsourcing of childcare and also domestic care in general. And Hong Kong has been a hub in some ways for migration of female workers from Indonesia and the Philippines, who essentially come to live with families to help take care of the children and help take care of the elderly. And for many, it presents the most affordable solution to the childcare issue, given that there is an absence of childcare facilities. But even within Hong Kong, if we think about who is a resident of Hong Kong, domestic helpers, as they are termed by the law, do not have any permanent right of abode. So even if they remained here for over 7 years, because of the perceived special nature of their work and their role, they would not actually receive permanent residency. For myself, if I stayed here more than 7 years, I would be able to apply for permanent residency. So there's a very clear distinction about possibly the types of workers that Hong Kong wants to retain. The workers are not also subject to statutory minimum wage. So in terms of the monthly salary, it equates to approximately 396 euros a month to carry out this domestic work. But if they were to be offered the minimum wage, they would be paid a lot higher. In terms of their salary, they would at least be paid triple that in euros. So there are problems. There is also the 2-week immigration rule. So if for any reason that individual's contract is terminated, they have to leave Hong Kong within 2 weeks. So if there's any problems, if they want to have any redress against the employer, it's very problematic. It seems like the power is extremely within the employer's hands rather than the employees. Okay, if we go to the next slide. For some of you, you might have seen some stories about the abuse potentially that these domestic workers face in Hong Kong. And the picture on the right-hand side is of Erwiana, who is an Indonesian domestic helper within Hong Kong and allegedly was tortured and abused by her employer. The case is currently ongoing at the moment. But I wanted to raise the issue of domestic helpers as a vulnerable group in Hong Kong. If we go to the next slide. Potentially these workers are vulnerable because of the intersection between gender, class, citizenship, race, and violence. They're in the domestic sphere, they're in the private sphere, so that also exposes them to an increased risk of abuse because this is taking place in a private setting, and also they are disempowered. If you think back to what I was saying about Chinese Confucian culture, filial piety, the status of men, for example, even within the family, within the household, there is a clear poverty and class divide between families and then the workers that are coming to live with them. And I wanted to flag up here a very interesting piece of work by an anthropologist, an American anthropologist, Nicole Constable, which is called Born Out of Place. And she makes the suggestion that often families, when they take on workers, they simply want a worker. They want someone who is going to perform well and do their duty. They don't really anticipate that they're getting a human and what a human might want from a working relationship, and also in terms of that individual's desire to have sexual and reproductive relationships. So this plays out in a challenge for families in Hong Kong. Often, if domestic helpers do become pregnant, they are dismissed by their employer, even though they are technically not supposed to be dismissed. And legally, they are protected by the Sex Discrimination Ordinance. But there is a lack of awareness about rights. And because of this unequal power relationship between employer and employee, it leaves these women particularly vulnerable. If we go to the next slide. So, for example, given this 2-week immigration rule, it means that helpers have to actually leave Hong Kong within 2 weeks. This is very problematic if a woman is pregnant, because often she would only reveal her pregnancy if it's at a very late stage. So it might actually be impractical to return home. She may not be able to return home because of the risks that she would face for gender-based violence, stigma and discrimination within her home country from her family and within her community. So often these women who do become pregnant end up in a very vulnerable position within Hong Kong. And at the same time, as I said, then if their status becomes an illegal status, they're not able to access public health facilities. So again, they have this risk of experiencing structural violence because of some of the laws and policies that are in place. Again, if they have children, if their children are born in Hong Kong, then their children also have no legal status. Okay. If we go to the next slide. I wanted to touch on this issue because it goes back to what I introduced right at the start, some of those exceptions under the basic law, and this idea about the protection of indigenous rights. Within Hong Kong, because of these protections, it means that male villagers actually have what is called a ding right. Under the small house policy, they are able to build a house on a piece of land within the new territories. Now, in 1997, Christine Lowe, a prominent Legislative Council member at the time, sought to try to reform this policy to extend gender equality to indigenous female villagers so that they could enjoy the same ding rights. It was termed as the female inheritance movement. But she did not succeed in that, and even herself, even if she was prominent, she had the threat to her personal safety. She was told that if you come to the new territories again, you will be raped. These are really kind of negative personal attacks which center on that individual's gender. So you can see that even in a very modern, contemporary society such as Hong Kong, there are still strong traditional values which impact on women's role. And I flag up here the Hung Yi Kok because they are the rural representative group for indigenous villages. They're quite a strong and powerful organization. And within Hong Kong, you do have strong organizations that can help to sustain and support these traditional policies so that you don't necessarily have a shift towards gender equality. If we go to the next slide. So I wanted to pick up that Hong Kong is in a very difficult position, I think, at the moment. On the one hand, Hong Kong is a developed special administrative region. It's capitalist. It feels incredibly modern in some ways, yet some of the legal framework, although the protections appear to be in place, there are some notable absences, and this leads to physical and structural gender-based violence, particularly for underrepresented groups within society. Lesbian, bisexual women, if they experience discrimination, if they're fired on the basis of their sexuality, then they have no legal recourse. There's no anti-discrimination legislation that they can turn to. Also, the immigration rules, the policies that are in place, can be detrimental for migrant domestic workers who experience discrimination. And we still have this continuance, this perpetuation of cycles of migration. So from developed to developing states, particularly from Southeast Asia to East Asia. And this cycle of migration and the fact that the majority of migrant workers are women also means there are gendered implications for migration and the way that both receiving states and host states facilitate that migration. And I think all too often women are extremely vulnerable, their status is extremely vulnerable in this situation. So I guess my summary in some ways is that this one country, two systems within Hong Kong does have serious implications because in many ways, even though Hong Kong is a developed capitalist special administrative region, it's still in somewhat of a transition. And no one really knows where it is going by 2047, whether it will become another Chinese city within China, whether socialist policies will apply by 2047, after 2047. It's difficult to say at this stage, but I think it's important that the struggles are kind of recognized that are taking place in Hong Kong. And my focus will shift now to think about states in transition. And I'm going to look very briefly about Nepal and then also look at the Philippines. So I've included a map here of Nepal, and I'd be very pleased if there are people from the Nepal section of WILPF, if they're listening today, they could also add to the conversation. But you can see towards the right-hand side of the map, Kathmandu, which is the capital. Nepal is a landlocked country. You can see China to the north and then India. It's an incredibly diverse country in terms of its geography. It's a Himalayan kingdom, but then also down by the south, you do have very what is referred to as the Terai region, which is much more flat. And you have an open, porous border to India. In terms of Nepal, it's in a kind of fragile state in some ways. So if we go to the next slide. I wanted to pull out about cultural, political, and social factors. Maoist insurgency lasted from 1996 to 2006, and it essentially challenged what was perceived to be a feudal governance system. And in terms of Nepal's diversity, even within society, it's incredibly multi-layered. It's very complex in terms of structural hierarchies. So the caste systems that are in place, the class systems that are in place, geographical factors as well. Some parts are extremely rural, mountainous and remote. And then power tends to be concentrated within Kathmandu, in the capital. In terms of a lack of development, this can potentially exacerbate issues in terms of the conflict, especially because power is deemed to be centered in Kathmandu. So there's groups within society who feel quite disempowered. I picked out about the legislative provisions in Nepal from the civil code. For instance, some examples for property. Although these are examples, I'm going to explain about them, but they've since been reformed. But just to give you a sense of the issues with them. For property, previously, it had to be returned to a paternal family after remarriage. For inheritance, you needed to reach the age of 35 in order to inherit property of a deceased husband. And this was very problematic because if an individual married their husband at a very young age and then the husband is killed, they become a widow at a very young age. And they might be in their 20s, but yet they can't inherit property. So some of these provisions were very detrimental to single women, to widows within Nepalese society. Another issue is in terms of citizenship. So previously, a male had to consent, to give their consent in order for a woman to be able to get a passport, to be able to acquire a passport. So you can see from even entrenched within the law, there are very discriminatory legal provisions. Now, fortunately, some of these have been reformed. These examples I've given have been reformed at least, not least through the lobbying of civil society organizations within Nepal, such as Women for Human Rights. And I think it's quite challenging in some ways that the role of the law can really inhibit women's liberty and their empowerment, and it can help to exacerbate conflict. Because what happened in Nepal, if we think about the impact, if we go to the next slide, the impact of the Maoist insurgency on women was such that you do see an increase in female-headed households, so widows and single women. And if you have these laws in place, then it's extremely problematic if you can't acquire property, if you lack ownership. At the same time, in Nepal also, women did participate in the conflict. They were combatants, and they participated as Maoist insurgents. So by no means are women only victims within the Nepalese conflict. They're also actors, they're combatants, and the impact on women really differs from whether women resided in conflict areas, if they had a direct role in conflict. Even the political affiliation of their husbands or families could impact on the way that they experience the conflict. So it is extremely complex when you look at how the conflict impacted on women. And if we go to the next slide. I wanted to come back to, of course, international law to think about the role here. Security Council Resolution 1325, which I'm sure most of you will be well versed with, but I just wanted to take you back to think about what the aims of that are, and to look at prevention, participation and protection, the 3 Ps that are really instrumental to the resolution. At the same time, it's a soft law instrument. It's not legally binding. It's very much dependent on the individual states' political will to do anything to implement the resolution. And one of the fallbacks, one of the weaknesses of the resolution's framework itself is the fact that there is a lack of monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. So in some ways it's perceived as being a bit of a paper tiger, that its aims are good, but when you come to implement it in practice, it's challenging. And I wanted to highlight in some ways the limitations here for how this plays out in practice in highly polarized settings. It's a very narrow definition of gender-based violence. It focuses largely on the physical. It doesn't necessarily frame, for instance, a woman's lack of participation as being gender-based violence. It doesn't really look to structural impediments to women, such as those discriminatory laws and how they might be perceived as being structurally violent towards women. There is also a lack of linkage with rights-based development. So in terms of for its application for some states, you don't necessarily have those nuanced connections made between peace and development and how they potentially go hand in hand with one another. Because it's not binding, as with international law, even that is technically binding, it's very hard to enforce in practice and implement. And I think when you try and apply it in highly polarized settings, this is where you see in some ways the challenges of implementation. So I wanted to think about the national level implementation and how the state is responding to 1325. Within the National Action Plan, they do have a matrix. They have 5 pillars, and it seems when you look at the Nepalese National Action Plan, I actually think it seems very progressive. It's very ambitious. I think in some ways it's a great, you know, aspirational action plan for trying to put 1325 into practice in by contextualizing it very specifically within the Nepalese context. Sorry, I need to pause just for a moment for drinking some water. I've got a slight cold, so I apologize if any of this is not being clear. In terms of Nepalese women, I think one of the most interesting things about the National Action Plan is that 14 subcategories of women are identified as being conflict-affected women. So it aims to move beyond simply recognizing women as women, but thinking about, for instance, single women, disabled women, women in detention, Maoist women, widows of security forces. There is an attempt to try to break down the definition of conflict-affected women, and that seems particularly progressive to me. Another issue is that the National Action Plan aims to foster a culture of accountability. It notes the specific agencies and the government departments which are responsible for different aspects of the National Action Plan. And though this might seem as something relatively straightforward, not all National Action Plans actually make those lines of accountability clear. The Nepalese National Action Plan does try to make those lines of accountability clear. Of course, in practice, it might be very difficult to actually ensure that those departments are accountable, but still, I think it's positive in terms of trying to foster that culture of accountability. But one of the issues that I see for the Nepalese National Action Plan is the capacity to implement. In many ways, these developing states are relying sometimes on external drivers, whether it be the UN, UN Women, donor agencies, to help support the development of these national action plans. And that might potentially undermine ownership of civil society organizations locally in terms of the implementation. So there could potentially be drawbacks, and I think that would be a major challenge in a developing context. if we go to the next slide, I wanted to pick up on the Philippines because also the Philippines has adopted a national action plan on 1325. In fact, it was the first Asian state to do so and the first state within Southeast Asia. And if you see on the map of the Philippines, there are many different islands. It's a very diverse country. You can see that Manila is actually far up in the north. Down in the very south, you can see Mindanao Island. Mindanao is actually where there is an armed insurgency, an ongoing insurgency by what is known as the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF. If we go to the next slide. So in terms of regional networks, Philippines in some ways is more connected to a regional framework because it is a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. What I would say about the ASEAN is that in many ways it has a culture of consensus and non-interference, and that distinguishes it from supranational bodies such as the European Union. So even though it is about collaboration, each state is very certain on its own sovereignty in a way that is somewhat different to, for instance, the European Union. And it is still within armed insurgency. So there has been a protracted insurgency for decades, both the National Democratic Front and also the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in Mindanao. In many ways, poverty is perceived to be a driving factor in the insurgency movement and fueling conflict. At the same time, in Mindanao, particularly, there are religious tensions between Islam and the Moro groups, and then Catholicism. And one other factor is the Philippines has a prevalence of small arms and gun violence. So women are exposed to a risk of very clear violence. If we go to the next slide, the Philippines, though, at the same time, it is pretty progressive in terms of its adoption of laws. In 2009, for instance, it created the Magna Carta of Women, which in many ways is perceived as being a Bill of Rights for women. And on paper, at least, it seems to be quite progressive in terms of its movement to adopt law and policy that try to foster gender equality. But if we go to the next slide, I would say that, again, the Philippines National Action Plan is a good model. It does cover small arms violence, so it helps to break down and really contextualize 1325 in a local setting. It's interesting in the fact that it does also try to further mainstream the National Action Plan in a local setting, in local gender and development processes. So it is making the connection between women, peace and security and development, which is missing in some ways in 1325 itself. One of the concerns I have with national action plans in general is the focus on quantitative indicators. So if I give you an example, for instance, the National Action Plan aims to address the special needs of women and girls. That resonates with operative paragraph 8 of 1325. At the same time, while they have this focus, how they measure it is through a rapid needs assessment. But when they try to evaluate the rapid needs assessment, they focus on a quantitative measure of the number of women assisted in psychological health. Of course, this is important to try to track the numbers of women in, receiving assistance, but at the same time, there's not really the qualitative measure of how does that process help those women in the longer term. You can count numbers, you can try and map statistics, but do you really get a proper impression of whether women are more empowered for having experienced that assistance? So I think, especially in these settings where you do have damage to infrastructure and you have a situation where it's incredibly fragile, there is the continuing risk of violence, that this focus on indicators, and particularly quantitative indicators, is very challenging. How do you measure the number of sexual assaults taking place? How do you guarantee that people will come forward and talk about rape or be prepared to explain about their experiences? And so in many of these situations, although there is a strong emphasis on trying to find the evidence for sexual violence within conflict settings, it is so insecure in that transitional phase that it's just really quite difficult to provide that sort of information. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to really frame this in terms of what are some common challenges. So I think for both Nepal and Philippines, there's a fragility of transition, and Nepal is maybe at a more advanced stage at the moment in terms of its transition. The Philippines is still experiencing this armed insurgency. The lack of development and poverty and how that can be overcome, even if you have the laws on paper and you try to implement the laws, sometimes if you don't have the economic and social policies in place to help support women's livelihood, that could also be detrimental and be perceived as a form of structural violence towards women. So of course it's very challenging to try to implement international norms, especially in these extremely polarized settings. 1325 itself is not really strong enough to suggest about discriminatory laws and their repeal. So it is very much dependent on individual states' will for political law reform. Of course, also because of the nature of the conflict that's taking place, because people are displaced, people are migrating from these states. And then this also ties in with this cycle of migration from developing to developed countries within Asia. In terms of my final slide, in some ways it's challenging to try and look at Hong Kong alongside Nepal and the Philippines, and I thank you for bearing with me and allowing me to talk through some of my concerns with these different areas within Asia. But for these examples that I've given, the aim is to try to think, you know, this is not just about being developed or developing. We can see here that irrespective of the level of development, cultural norms, laws and policies can actually trigger and also sustain gender-based violence as well as physical gender-based violence. So even in a society where you imagine that actually women appear to be quite equal, women go out to work, there's double income families as there are in Hong Kong, there are still elements of practice within society where there are vulnerable groups of women. And I think it's important to say that this is not unique to Asia, and it would be interesting to hear more broadly about perspectives and parallels from other regions, to think about how do we start to address cultural norms, laws and policies that do trigger and sustain gender-based violence. We don't have any international law that focuses specifically on violence against women. How do we get there? How do we draw on all these multiple perspectives from different regions, where it seems that irrespective of the level of development, violence is continuing. At the same time, I think the challenges might be more acute within Asia because there is this resistance to international norms on human rights. There is also weak reporting on CEDAW, and there is a lack of regional human rights bodies or mechanisms. So in some ways, there is not the cohesiveness across states within Asia to drive forward standards on norms on violence against women. It's potentially more complicated. And I'd like to stop there and thank you for allowing me to speak and talk through my ideas. And I'd be very happy to hear your thoughts and also to try to take questions where I can.
Right. Thank you very much, Amy. That was incredibly interesting. So now we will move on to the question and answer or discussion part of the webinar. So for anyone who wants to ask a question, you can either raise your hand by clicking the little hand icon on your control panel. I will then see your hand and I can then unmute you. If you are a little bit shy, you can also type in your question under the question bit of your control panel, and I will read your question out loud. We would love to hear a little bit about yourself, maybe your name or what you do or why you're interested in this topic. That would be great. So I have a question, someone raising their hand, Betsy Kawamura, sorry for butchering your name. I am unmuting you right now. Go ahead, Betsy.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Hi, Amy. This is Betsy. We met through WILPF in the UK. I'm the one from Norway. I look Japanese. Do you remember me? You were getting your PhD, I think, in 1325 issues many years ago in the UK.
Can you hear me? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, hi. I wasn't sure if I'm muted at the moment. Hi, Betsy. It's nice to hear your voice. I remember you well.
It's been a long time. Well, I've been, continuing work on gender issues, and I'm also working now on North Korea. There's like a huge there's like a huge problem with North Korean refugee women. And some of my friends who are working together on the UN Commission of Inquiry, and so I was lecturing on North Korean gender issues at University of Bradford. Have you come across any work on North Korean refugee women at all, and the issues of how 1325 is looked at in China? The reason why I'm asking is that for the CSW, for the Commission on Status of Women in New York for next year, I'm thinking of going to discuss the particular problems of North Korean refugee women, how China forcibly repatriates them, and the need for the international community to take a look, at how vulnerable these women are. So I've been able to create, various points and lectures and awareness campaigns about this. So I just wanted to ask you if you have any ideas of looking at, South Korea, China, and Japan, and North Korea more in 1325.
Yeah, I would say at the moment I've been doing some work on national action plans and the development of them within Asia, and currently there is the South Korea has actually developed a national action plan, as well as Nepal and the Philippines. But I think Japan is in the process of developing a national action plan, and that should be out possibly by the end of the year, but it might creep into 2015. But as far as China goes, I don't think there is any specific move towards developing a national action plan on 1325. And it's interesting that you mentioned about North Korea. Actually, I would be fascinated to know more about the situation in North Korea. There was supposed to be actually a seminar next week here in Hong Kong, which was looking at North Korea and the role of people that have defected from North Korea. And so we were supposed to actually hear from Michael Kirby, who led the UN inquiry on North Korea, as well as people who had defected. But because of the current political situation in Hong Kong, the event's been cancelled. So it's been postponed. I don't know when we'll get a chance to hear more directly from those people, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think there is anything firm taking place on 1325 in China.
All right, thank you, Amy. I have another question from Marty from Australia. She's written, he or she has written it down, so I'll just read the question.
Okay, thanks.
I've read some critical perspectives that the human rights movement for Tibetans is Western focused and reliant on these individualized universal human rights norms. How should Western activists approach the issue to enable the Tibetans to achieve self-determination in a culturally sensitive way that also respects China's notion of collective rights? Thanks.
Oh gosh, what a question. And I don't think I'm the best placed person to answer it, but I think it's very difficult in terms of the Chinese government's perspective on these things, and I don't know enough about Tibet to be able to help in that regard or make any concrete suggestions, but I would like to draw upon what's been happening in Hong Kong at the moment. There has been a number of statements made by the Chinese government in terms of foreign interference in Hong Kong and Occupy Central and the role of the United States and the UK. And I think it's very dangerous to make such a suggestion, because I think for those people within Hong Kong that are leading the Occupy Central movement, you know, I don't think there's any way that this is about foreign interference, and I think it undermines the local democracy movement and what is taking place. I don't really know how you can challenge the Chinese government, their official line on these things, when they result to this fallback position of saying about foreign interference. I think the Tibetans are significantly disadvantaged, and in terms of empowerment, I don't know how you can work with them and empower them individually, because it's very challenging. What happens with these people if they are so disempowered that they can't stand up to the Chinese government and to the central authorities? So I think there's a very positive role that actually international support can play. I think it's important to try and have a sense of ownership at the local level, but at the same time, for people, if they are entirely disempowered, and there's a situation taking place in China with human rights lawyers in China as well. What do you do in that situation? Sometimes having that international focus and that international pressure can help to protect people. I don't really feel like I have the right answer for you, but I think still international organizations can play a positive role, but they also have to work on trying to build capacity for self-ownership over these strategies.
All right, then we have a question from Catherine from Austria. Catherine, go ahead.
Hello, Amy. I want to thank you for a super interesting presentation. But I would like to hear something about femicide, since we're talking about gender and violence in Asia. We haven't heard anything about it. So I would just like to know how is the situation overall, and maybe you know a little bit about legal status at the moment. Thank you.
Hi, I'm really sorry. I couldn't hear you very well because I have the air conditioning going in the room that I'm in. I don't know if Emma would be able to summarize or repeat.
Catherine was asking about femicide. We haven't heard about that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the status of femicide in Asia overall, or more specifically in the countries you talked about, and especially also if there's anything in the legal framework addressing femicide. Did you get that?
Yeah, thank you. I would say that I probably don't have sufficient expertise to talk about femicide, but I think certainly within states within Asia, where there is a strong preference for a male child, it is probably still a continuing problem. In China, it depends how you're defining femicide as well. I mean, in China, I think there are probably a high number of abortions to, get rid of the female fetus, because there is such a strong preference for males, and it's certainly an ongoing problem. In India, I don't know if femicide is a state where that would be more of an issue. But I don't know, maybe you can explain to me about your definition.
All right. Maybe I can follow up on Catherine's question with a question I had of my own.
Yeah.
I was wondering, you mentioned that in Hong Kong there are a lot of single women. And so that led me to think of why that is, how long that's been the case, and what are the implications of that specifically. And I was just wondering, this one-child policy in China, is that the same in Hong Kong, or does that influence that situation? Is that the reason why? I'd be very interested to learn about that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that I can probably answer that question more easily. In terms of the one-child policy, it applies only to China. It doesn't apply to Hong Kong. And it is changing somewhat in China. In some areas, I think there are some adjustments, like if both parents are only children themselves, then they're allowed to have more than one child in some areas of China. And I think that's to try to redress what has become a gender imbalance between men and women. So they're starting to recognize that, this is actually becoming a bit of a problem in terms of the gender imbalance. But that does impact on Hong Kong, because that maybe feeds into the reason why you do have more women coming to Hong Kong to give birth. Partly, if they come to Hong Kong to give birth, there's a number of reasons why it is taking place, but if it is a second child, they can come to Hong Kong, they can give birth legitimately. Their child will have Hong Kong permanent resident status, so they will have some sort of legal protection for that child. If people do become pregnant with a second child in China, they can face pressure to abort the child. At the same time, they can also, if they do go through the pregnancy and they're able to have the child, they have to pay a very large fine. If they don't pay the fine, then basically the child is unregistered. So this is feeding into why some women are coming to Hong Kong to give birth. And I think I can't remember, you asked some other question as well. I went to the one-child policy first, about single women.
Yes.
Single women in Hong Kong, I don't know why there is this increasing phenomenon. I think partly it is because it's quite a developed capitalist society. Maybe women appear to have greater gender equality, so you have a lot of women who are choosing to work for longer, who are maybe choosing not to marry at a younger age. But I think there is an incredible amount of pressure on those women that they are single women. It's still quite conservative in the sense within Hong Kong society that there's a lot of focus on the family. You often get asked, about marriage and about children. So I think although this is taking place, and it's partly to do with the level of development in capitalism, but it has negative implications there's a lot of, I think, discrimination towards single women within Hong Kong. And so recently there was a TV program which was heavily criticized for its negative perception of single women. You know, the phrases that were used to describe these single women, really like negative connotations about them. And I would certainly say it's not a positive, you know, thing. That's also a form of gender-based violence towards, you know, women who don't necessarily conform to a stereotype within society.
Right, that's very clear.
I don't know if that fully answered your question. Just my thoughts.
Yes, it did. It did. We have one more question that's been written in. Now would be the time for anyone else to still raise your hand or write your questions. We have a written question that's a bit difficult to read, so I'm going to try to summarize. You mentioned the dismissal of pregnant helpers, domestic helpers. This person is wondering, are there any NGOs in Hong Kong trying to raise awareness? Because you said that was the main problem. And if those NGOs would be subsidized by the Hong Kong government, is that is that an activity that they're interested in supporting NGOs to undertake?
Yeah, I would say there's an excellent organization that if you're interested in, please do go to their website called Pathfinders. The chief executive officer is Kay McArdle, and she's really been working with her team to try and raise awareness. It's a relatively young organization, but it was started because the founders, two of the founders, were in a part of Hong Kong, and they went into this room, and there were these children that were there and in terrible health condition, and they thought, how can this be? You know, we're in Hong Kong, we're a developed capitalist society, and yet we still have these children who are very terrible issue in terms of, like, I think it was tuberculosis or typhoid, sorry, and it was like, how can this be taking place? And then when they started to ask the women that were with the children, then they started to realize about the vulnerability of this particular group. So Pathfinders focus is actually to work to improve the lives of these migrant children. So it's child-centered. I'm not sure whether they are subsidized by the government. I don't think they are subsidized. I think they apply for grants and receive funding from other avenues. The government, I would say, are probably not, well, I think they're probably aware about some of the issues, but then not actively engaging with the issues. And Kay, along with Pathfinders, is really trying to lobby the government, and the way that they've proceeded to do things has increasingly been through litigation to try to challenge the government, and trying to table proposals at the Legislative Council to raise awareness about what's happening, and to identify in many ways the gaps in the legal framework, and how this has a negative impact for women and migrant children in Hong Kong. So if you want to go to their organization, it's called Pathfinders.
All right, then we have a question from Betsy. I think she's raised her hand and written it out. Her question is, can we have a copy of your presentation, because she missed the earlier part? I can answer that for everyone. Yes, the whole presentation is recorded, so we will be sharing the link with all the participants maybe tomorrow or maybe on Monday, where you can watch it all back, and our other episodes on YouTube. Then we have another question from Mirko Fernandez from Geneva. He or she, sorry, is a human rights and security specialist. It's a question about local security governance mechanisms. There is a global movement towards decentralizing governance. This includes for police strategies and local security councils. In Latin America, there are social security council mechanisms where authorities are mandated to consult stakeholders, including civil society, on security needs with the goal of jointly creating security plans. I believe these are good mechanisms for the implementation of gender-sensitive security programs such as UNCR 1325. In Hong Kong, there exist the district councils charged with affecting the well-being of the people in the district. Are these district councils the mechanisms similar to the local security council? If so, are they connected to victim referral network systems? Also, are these district councils mandated to consult with vulnerable groups? So that's a lot to take on. Amy, go ahead. I can repeat parts of the question if you like.
Firstly, I think, if there's any more participatory mechanism to help work at local levels to implement 1325, I think that's something to be welcomed, because I think from my own experience in understanding about 1325 and how it works, it can't be a purely top-down mechanism. It has to come from the grassroots. So whether that be from district level committees, or whether it be from civil society organizations who work at the grassroots level trying to foster understanding about 1325, then I think that is the way to strengthen its implementation. It has to come from the bottom up. In terms of the district council system within Hong Kong, I don't think that I'm best positioned to maybe answer that in terms of looking at it from a security perception. District councillors are there to represent the needs of various districts and the communities within that district. So they would look at a range of issues that might be, for instance, housing, also about development within districts, because development is a major issue within Hong Kong, especially about urban land and development of areas. One of the issues at the moment in my own local district is about whether they reclaim land, land reclamation, and use that for developing more accommodation, more public housing. So they're the type of community level issues that they deal with. I'm not sure how directly they deal with the issue of domestic violence, for instance, but having said that, the Social Welfare Department of Hong Kong, when it does include a breakdown of statistics about levels of violence, it does do that according to the district. But I'm not sure whether that's necessarily the role of the district councillor, or whether that's the social welfare department in their own work that are doing that breakdown. I'm afraid I don't have the detailed knowledge to be able to give you an answer.
All right, Mirko, if you would like to follow up on your question, please raise your hand or write a follow-up on that. We have a question from our member in Japan, Nagako Sugimori. She's asking about suffrage in Hong Kong. Maybe you can clarify briefly the situation of suffrage in Hong Kong. I know you touched on it in your presentation, but maybe you can outline it clearly again.
Yeah, there's no universal suffrage at the moment, but within the basic law, it does include a provision, Article 45, which suggests that we will move towards universal suffrage. But at the moment, the central government within Beijing is saying for at least the appointment of the chief executive, that from 2 to 3 candidates, they would have to first be put forward by a nominating committee. So their argument is that every person will have like one person, one vote. They will be able to elect the chief executive, but still the candidates will be selected from a nominating committee. So in some ways it's a kind of screening process of the candidates, and then people will be able to have one person, one vote. But the issue I think that is of concern to Occupy Central organizers and also to the students is that there is, if there's this vetting, then it's inevitable that this person is going to be of a certain political affiliation. I think there's a concern on the part of the central government that this person should love Hong Kong, love China, and I think they would be concerned maybe if there is like a pan-democrat that was able to get through the process and then become a candidate, and what that would mean in terms of the leadership of Hong Kong. So at the moment, no universal suffrage. The current reform is to talk about 2017. So if it passes through the Legislative Council, then it means in 2017 there will be one person, one vote, but it will be from basically screened candidates that are put forward by a nominating commission. I hope that helps to answer it. I don't know what it means in the longer term, but that's the short-term answer.
Yes, Nagako writes, thank you so much for your explanation about the Hong Kong situation with regards to election and suffrage. So I think you answered the question perfectly. So I think that's all for the questions. Betsy, I promise I'll get to yours. We're going to share some contact details at the very end now.
I would like to say, if I may, I thank you so much for the questions. They're all really interesting, and I'm afraid with some aspects, of course, I'm working on elements of Asia, but it goes to show that Asia is such a diverse region. I don't necessarily have all the answers, so I humbly apologize if I can't answer all of the questions. And I would say I'd be very happy to be in touch with people if they want to keep in contact, and it would be nice to reconnect with Betsy and other people within the region who are working within Asia.
All right, so thank you very much, Amy, for that wonderful presentation and for being willing to be in touch with the participants on any other questions they might have. On the screen now are some of our contact details. For example, mine, if you have any questions about Women's Power to Stop War or WILPF in general. But for any questions towards Amy or other academics in our network, please write to academic@wilpf.ch and we'll make sure to get the emails to the right person. We're getting in a few thank yous from different people. I will give the floor now to Barbara to close. And I understand that I wasn't sharing my screen at the beginning of the presentation, so we will just go back to the essay competition just to make sure you all are aware of that. So there it is. And Barbara, you can unmute yourself. Go ahead, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your excellent presentation. I think your concrete examples from the three countries were very insightful and really show us how some laws and norms can silence and perpetuate violence, and also how the intersectionality of gender, race, and class, for example, may exacerbate this violence. So thank you so much. Thank you all for participating. And yes, I will just very briefly repeat a few information about the essay competition as you couldn't see it. So feel yourself very much invited to submit an essay on how would you change the current narrative of peacemaking to be more holistic. You have a good time because the deadline is in the end of December. And our three wonderful scholars of the academic network, Cynthia and Laurie Cohen and Claire Duncan, so we read them and choose the winner, and we have some very cool prizes. So for more details, please just check the website www.womenstopwar.org essay competition. Thank you.